Begin with an overview of Azure AD. So what is Azure Active Directory? This is a multi-tenant cloud-based directory and identity management system that runs within the Azure platform. This is an example of you having a platform as a service. Azure AD, in addition to being an identity engine, also serves as a platform that you can build additional identity solutions on. It's not designed to work in isolation. It can work with many other tools, applications, and technologies that need an identity provider. For example, it can integrate with your on-premises Windows Server Active Directory. It can integrate with other software as a service providers. For example, Office 365, SAP, Dropbox, and literally hundreds and hundreds of others. This gives you the basic set of tools that you need for authentication, authorization, and then also synchronization within a fully cloud-enabled environment. As an example of some of the different scenarios that Azure AD can leverage, this is a kind of a broad list, but for example, you can actually have B2B integration collaboration. You can implement something called conditional access, which we'll look at a little bit later on. Dynamic groups. You can integrate with Office 365. You can create Active Directory Federation services integrations. There's a broad range of tools and applications and scenarios that ultimately have Azure Active Directory at their core as that database of users, of groups, of rules, of permissions that govern access to any resources, whether it's in the cloud or within your on-premise network. So one implementation of Azure AD is for cloud applications. For example, services such as Office 365 Dynamics or Intune. Any application out there requires a directory of some sort. They need a list of users and groups that can access things and have permissions and use different services. Every single one of these cloud services can have its own directory, or they can share a single directory for unified authentication. For example, maybe you have a company and you want users to be able to access not just Office 365, but Microsoft Intune, but Microsoft CRM, Azure, and some third-party applications you subscribe to, and some applications that you build yourself. You wouldn't want all those different scenarios to have individual user accounts. Azure Active Directory provides that central store that all these different application platforms can leverage as their source of authentication. They don't worry about authentication themselves. They simply ask Azure AD, authenticate this user. If they're authenticated, look internally at their own permissions and then grant or deny that user access. And this gives you some pretty substantial benefits. Number one, any application that you have can benefit from these capabilities. Number one, single sign-on, one user ID, one password for everything that I need to access. Multi-factor authentication. Instead of a username and a password, it's a username and a device. Or maybe you can include biometrics, or maybe you can include certificate-based authentication, or smart card-based authentication, or any combination thereof. So it allows you to have stronger overall authentication of users. You can implement self-service tools, for example, password reset and group management. Both of these tools enable the user to perform common tasks such as creating security groups or resetting a password using security questions without needing to involve the administrator, which empowers them to do more for themselves. You can benefit from role-based access control. You can create roles that represent combinations or collections of tasks users are allowed to perform, and then grant users those roles. Within Azure Active Directory, you can then query which users contain which roles without having to build that framework in your own custom applications. Now, as we had mentioned, this is very different than what we traditionally think of as Active Directory, which is Windows Server Active Directory. Just to kind of compare and contrast the two, for most IT professionals that are used to Windows Server, they think in terms of OUs and group policy objects, containers, domains, trusts, things of that nature. None of those concepts exist within Azure Active Directory. Windows Server Active Directory is a true X500-based directory service. It's a true directory. It's designed for on-premise, multi-domain, or single large domain implementations where you have a lot of control over things like user structures, organizational units, group policies, etc. Azure Active Directory is primarily designed to be an identity solution for internet-based applications. It's designed to be usernames and passwords, authentication only. There is no notion of OUs or GPOs or any of those concepts that exist within Windows Server Active Directory. It is strictly a user account password database, along with an incredibly rich set of management tools that allow you to implement policy on those users and groups and roles. The way that you access it with Windows Server Active Directory is based over Kerberos and being a member of a domain. With Azure Active Directory, you can register with a domain, which doesn't guarantee management, but then you implement things like federation services and HTTP-based protocols to access other applications or other directories. So the idea of extending scope with Windows Server Active Directory is based on trusts. With Azure Active Directory is based on federation.